Let's take a trip back to the Absaroka Mountains in the Wyoming Territory. It's late November, 1887. Winter hadn't just arrived. It had settled in with a vengeance. The season came early, heavy and cruel, locking down the high ridges like a beast claiming its territory. The wind up there wasn't just cold. It howled through the timber with a bitterness that felt sharper than a knife blade. The forest floor was already buried under snow, knee-deep in the spots where the drifts had piled up, erasing any path that might have been there before. In the middle of this white desolation, we find Nancy Wynn. She's bracing her shoulder against a massive fallen log, the sweat literally freezing at her temples. Her breath is puffing out in ragged, exhausted clouds. And here's the kicker. Nancy is 8 months pregnant. She was moving like a woman whose body had absolutely nothing left to give, completely claimed by exhaustion, yet her spirit just refused to lie down and quit. The clearing she had picked out for her shelter was, well, crude is putting it politely. It was for rough log walls that barely held together, with gaps wide enough for the wind to whistle right through. The roof was nothing more than a canvas tarp, weighted down by stones and sagging dangerously in the middle. Snow was already clinging to the edges of that canvas, seeping through the corners like a silent warning that this structure wasn't going to hold. Nancy dropped the log she was struggling with. She let out a grunt of pain and leaned hard against the frame of her shelter, one hand rubbing the small of her back, the other instinctively pressing against her belly. Her coat was hanging open, and not because she wanted it to. She simply couldn't button it anymore. If you looked at her hands, you'd see fingers cracked and split from the biting cold and rope burns. Her lips were turning purple, but she kept moving. She had to. She looped a rough length of rope around the next log. Her hands were trembling so badly that the knot slipped. "Damn it," she whispered, the curse slipping through chattering teeth. The wind picked up, mocking her effort. She pushed her body forward, dragging that heavy timber inch by agonizing inch toward the wall. She had to pause just to catch her breath. The baby shifted low in her belly, a sharp, heavy reminder of what was at stake. Something inside her tightened panic, maybe, or pain, but she ignored it. She reached for the timber again, but then movement caught her eye. A shadow shifted in the tree line. It was a figure on foot broad, cloaked in a long fur coat with snow clinging to the hem. He stepped into the clearing without saying a word, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. Nancy froze instantly. Her hands flew to the axe she kept within arm's reach. The man stopped. He raised both hands slowly, palms open to show he was empty-handed. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and low, vibrating through the cold air. "I do not mean you harm." Nancy narrowed her eyes. She didn't let go of the axe. He moved forward slowly, stopping right beside that sagging beam she had been trying to raise. He glanced once at her swollen belly, then crouched down. With just one hand, he lifted the log into place. You could see the muscles flex beneath his heavy coat. Quiet and sure, he wedged the beam into its joint atop the wall, adjusting it with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Then he stepped back. He didn't even look her in the eye. "You are doing fine, ma'am," he said. "I just helped once. You do not owe me anything." She stared at him, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Snow caught on her eyelashes. He gave her a slight nod, turned on his heel, and walked back into the trees without another word. His footprints trailed behind him, deep and deliberate, slowly being swallowed up by the falling snow. Nancy stood there for a long time, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Slowly, she lowered the axe and leaned against the cabin wall. Her knees buckled slightly. One hand went to her belly again as the baby kicked. Tears stung her eyes, hot against the freezing air, but she swallowed them down. "I cannot do this alone," she whispered to the wind. "But I cannot trust another man again." The snow whispered against the canvas roof, and the clearing fell silent. Nancy closed her eyes, her chin trembling. Winter was far from over, and she was still very much alone. The next morning, the sun crept over the ridge with that hesitant, pale winter light that offers no heat, cold as bone. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust of ice. Nancy stirred beneath a thin quilt, her breath visible in the morning air. her belly pressed outward beneath her coat, taut and heavy. She shifted slowly, wincing as her joints ached from the cold. When she finally pushed open the cabin door, the world lay silent. But there, sitting in the snow, was a rough burlap sack. Nancy stared at it. There were no footprints surrounding it, though the wind could have easily covered them up during the night. She stepped forward carefully, her boots crunching over the frost. Kneeling down, she opened the sack with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a treasure trove for a survivalist: a coil of fresh rope, a tin of lamp oil, a small sack of nails wrapped in oilcloth, and a bundle of something dark, thick, and fragrant. It was venison dried and smoked. There was no note, no mark. Nancy glanced toward the trees, scanning the darkness of the forest. "Is this a joke?" she muttered, her voice cracking in the cold. The only answer she got was the wind whispering. Through the pines, confused but desperate, she carried the sack inside. That night, she lit her lamp with the new oil, her fingers hesitant, almost feeling ashamed to accept the help. She hung the rope by the door. She left the meat untouched for hours, staring at it, until hunger won out. Finally, she carved off a small piece and chewed it slowly, staring into the flames of her small fire, wondering who was out there in the dark. It didn't stop there. The next morning, Nancy stepped out to find a neat stack of firewood, split and ready, waiting near the cabin wall. 2 days later, a bundle of roofing shingles appeared. Then came a woolen blanket, soft, thick, and cleaner than anything she had owned in a long time. Nancy stood in the doorway, clutching that blanket in both hands, her jaw set tight. She looked out at the silent forest, frustration bubbling up in her chest. "Stop pitying me," she shouted into the woods, her voice echoing off the pines. "I do not need saving." Silence. She pressed the blanket to her chest, her hands trembling. No answer came back, just the wind. Later that week, she had to brave the trip into town. She rode a borrowed mule, and her belly made every movement slow and awkward. But she was out of flour and salt. She couldn't put it off any longer. When she walked into the general store, the conversation died instantly. Eyes turned. Whispered voices rose behind her back as she moved through the aisles. "That's the one building up on Timber Creek," someone muttered. "Heard some mountain man's been leaving her supplies. Strange fellow." Nancy kept her chin high. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she refused to meet anyone's gaze. She paid for her goods with coins she could barely afford to lose, then turned and left without a word. What she didn't know was that in the trees beyond the ridge, Rowan Pike stood watch. He didn't follow her into town, and he didn't speak to her. He only made sure she returned safely. Each night, he watched the soft flicker of firelight behind the gaps in her unfinished cabin. His hands bore fresh blisters from chopping wood for her, but he never knocked on her door. He remembered too well the face of his fiancée, a woman lost to a snowstorm he couldn't outrun. He remembered the hour he left her alone to fetch firewood, an hour he had never forgiven himself for. So now, with Nancy, he stayed distant, silent, useful. It was enough to keep her going, until the wind changed. One night, the moon vanished behind thick clouds, and the mountain wind began to howl. It tore through the clearing like a wild animal, whizzing through the gaps in Nancy's walls. The canvas roof flapped violently, held down only by fraying ropes. A high-pitched creaking sound echoed through the room, wood straining against the pressure. Nancy sat curled in a corner, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her breath catching in her throat. The baby shifted low, heavy and sharp. The cold was seeping in from every direction. Then she heard a sound, not the wind, but metal on wood, hammering. She stiffened. It was coming from the roof. She crawled to the wall, her heart thudding against her ribs, and peered through a crack in the log seam. She saw him. Rowan Pike was balanced on her roof like a shadow, bracing himself against the gusts. His coat flared in the wind as he hammered a beam into place, driving new nails into the wood she couldn't reach. The storm screamed around him, but he didn't pause. "Why?" she whispered, her forehead pressed against the cold wall. "Are you trying to keep me alive?" The hammering stopped for a breath. Rowan's head turned slightly, as if he heard her, but he said nothing. Then he lifted the hammer again and kept working. Nancy pressed both hands to her belly. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. She didn't want to need him. She hated needing him. But she wasn't sure she would last the winter without him. The storm didn't come with a whisper, it came with a howl. By mid-morning the next day, the peaks of the Absaroka Range were swallowed by dark, bruised clouds. The air turned electric, sharp with the scent of snow and imminent threat. Nancy looked up from the creek. She had gone farther than usual, farther than she should have, dragging a small sled behind her. She was desperate for water and a few more branches of firewood before the storm truly set in. She knew the signs, everyone out here did, but she had waited too long. The wind snapped the trees into violent motion, whipping the snow sideways. Visibility dropped in minutes. What was once a narrow path became a blinding sea of white. The woods blurred, the sky disappeared. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. Nancy tightened her coat, pulling the fur lining close around her neck. Her breath came faster, short, shallow gasps. The baby pressed low inside her, the weight dragging her forward. She stumbled once, then twice, her boots skidding in the deepening snow. Steady, she whispered, as if she could will herself upright. But then the wind roared, and suddenly, she couldn't tell which direction she had come from. The trees twisted into white shadows. Her knees buckled, and she fell to one side, her hands sinking into the drift. Her body trembled uncontrollably. She pushed herself up slowly, but a wave of dizziness struck her. Her lips were numb. Her vision blurred. That was when she saw him. Rowan Pike moved through the storm like the weather recognized him. Snow clung to his coat, his hat was pulled low, and a scarf was wrapped high around his face. He cut through the white wall of snow and reached her in furlong strides. "You're off the trail," he said. His voice was low and certain, cutting right through the wind. Nancy tried to respond, but her throat was raw. He crouched beside her, steadying her with a hand just above her elbow, careful not to touch her skin. "Never skin," he muttered to himself, then louder, to her, "You need to get back, now." I lost the path," she whispered, her breath hitching in her chest. "I know," he said. "Come on, breathe." He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a coil of rope. With quick, practiced hands, he tied one end around her waist, loose enough for comfort, but tight enough for safety. The other end, he tied securely round his own waist. "Why?" she stammered, staring at the knot. "Double quotes to keep you from getting lost again," he said simply. He tightened the knot one last time. "Hold on to me." They began moving slowly, fighting every inch of the way. Rowan led them through the blinding blizzard. Every time Nancy stumbled, the rope went taut, and he was there to catch her. She slipped again, her boots finding no purchase on the ice, but he pulled her upright without ever breaking his stride. Behind them, the mule brayed in fear, its eyes wide and rolling. Rowan turned back once, just long enough to tie the reins securely to his saddle horn. "He'll follow," he shouted over the wind. The wind screamed, snow pressing in from all sides like a physical weight. Then Rowan did something she didn't expect. He pulled open his thick, fur-lined coat and wrapped it around her shoulders from behind, sheltering her with his entire body. The cold slammed into his back, unprotected now, but he didn't even flinch. Nancy, half frozen and dizzy, let herself lean into him. Each step was a battle. The wind tried to turn them back, tried to bury them right there in the drift. Nancy's legs gave out again, and this time, she couldn't rise. "I can't," she whispered, the words lost in the gale. Rowan looked down at her, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. Then, without a word, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She gasped, shocked by the sudden heat radiating from his chest and the sheer strength in his hold. He carried her to the mule, mounted first, then pulled her gently onto the saddle in front of him. One arm wrapped around her back to hold her steady. The other held the reins. He bent his head low, shielding her face from the biting wind with his own body. Her head lolled against his chest, exhaustion taking over. "Why?" she murmured, her voice faint. "Why do you keep helping me?" Rowan didn't answer right away. When his voice finally came, it was soft and hoarse. "Because once, there was someone I didn't get to in time." Nancy closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she let someone else carry the weight. By the time they reached the cabin, the worst of the storm had passed, though the wind still hissed beyond the walls. Snow clung to the windows like frostbitten lace. Inside, the fire flickered low, casting long, swaying shadows across the timber walls. Rowan remained near the door, sitting just beside it with his back against the logs. He didn't cross into the center of the room. His presence was quiet and steady, as if he were guarding the threshold between the woman and the storm outside. Nancy sat at the table, bundled in every spare layer she owned. Her body ached, and the baby kicked softly beneath her ribs, a constant reminder of what she was fighting for. She watched Rowan through the haze of the firelight. "Why are you still here?" she asked. He didn't look up. "The storm hasn't gone." Just paused to catch its breath. "I mean, here with me." He glanced at her then, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath falter. "Because no one should be alone when it comes back." Silence settled between them again, heavy but not uncomfortable. Nancy's voice broke it, quiet but deliberate. "I was married back east," she began, "to a man who told me he loved me." Rowan listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He convinced me to leave everything, promised we'd build a life in the West. But after we married, he gambled away my dowry, drank through my savings. And when I told him I was pregnant, he panicked. He told my family I'd cheated, lied, said the child wasn't his." She stared at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "They believed him. My father called me a disgrace, said I brought shame on our name. They threw me out, told me never to come back." She gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "All my life they wanted me to marry well. And when I did, it still wasn't enough." Rowan's voice was low. "So you came here to fight for something of your own?" Nancy nodded. "To prove I could make a place in the world, even if no one believed I could." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He walked slowly to the table and placed it in front of her. Nancy looked down, puzzled. "Open it," he said. Inside lay a hand-carved wooden mallet, smooth with age. The handle was worn where fingers had gripped it for years. "She made that," he said softly. "My fiancé. She carved toys for the valley children. That was her favorite tool. Her father gave it to her." Nancy's voice softened. "What happened to her?" "There was a storm," he said simply. "I left to check the traps. Told her I'd be gone 10 minutes. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Nancy's chest tightened. "The avalanche," he nodded. "I dug until my hands bled. Never found her." Silence stretched again, filled only by the crackling fire. "Why give this to me?" she asked. "Because she would have wanted to help you," Rowan replied. "And you're building something worth protecting." Nancy swallowed the lump in her throat, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the mallet. "Thank you." Just then, 3 sharp knocks shattered the quiet. Rowan stood instantly. Nancy rose, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of icy air that swirled around the room. Standing there was a man who looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a city banquet. He wore a polished wool coat. His boots were spotless despite the weather, and his gloves looked far too fine for this rough part of the world. But on his chest, a badge gleamed in the firelight. "Gideon Reeves," he announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Federal Land Inspector." Nancy's voice caught in her throat. "Can I help you?" Reeves didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept around the small room, taking in the repairs, the fire, and finally resting on Rowan. A smug, tight smile curled his lips. "Well," Reeves said, the word dripping with insinuation, "looks like you're not living alone after all." Nancy's hands flew instinctively to her belly. A protective gesture. "I filed this claim fairly. You filed under the single residency clause," Reeves countered, his voice smooth and bureaucratic. "Unassisted development. A man sleeping under your roof violates that clause." Rowan stepped forward, his size suddenly filling the small space between the inspector and Nancy. "I do not live here." Reeves ignored him entirely, keeping his eyes on Nancy. "This claim is now void. It'll be reassigned by spring." Nancy's voice cracked. "You can't do that." Reeves stepped closer, and his voice dropped, becoming low and cruel. "You're just a girl playing settler with a hunter by your side. That's not homesteading, darling. That's charity." The word hit Nancy harder than the cold. Her knees nearly buckled. Tears welled in her eyes, fueled by anger and exhaustion. This land, it's all I have. Rowan moved then. He stepped directly between them, his hand bracing against the doorframe to block Reeves' path further into the room. His voice was ice. You'll take this land over my dead body. Reeves looked up at the mountain man, his eyes narrowing. He measured the threat, saw the resolve in Rowan's stance, and decided not to push his luck. Not today. He turned on his heel. We'll see, Reeves muttered, and slammed the door behind him. Nancy sank into the nearest chair, shaking uncontrollably. Rowan didn't move from the door for a long time, but for the first time since they met. He stayed inside. The wind never stopped that night. It clawed at the seams of the cabin, shrieking through the cracks in the timber as if it were trying to get inside, to finish what Reeves had started. Snow beat against the walls with unrelenting fury, and the cold crept in from every direction. Nancy lay curled on a bedding of pine boughs and blankets near the fire, her face pale and her lips drawn tight. Sweat clung to her brow despite the chill in the room. Her breath came fast, shallow, erratic gasps. It had started just after midnight. A sharp, low pain in her abdomen had woken her with a gasp. She'd tried to convince herself it was nothing, just strain from lifting too much the day before, or a false alarm brought on by the stress of the inspector's visit. But it wasn't. She was in labor, and she was a month early. Rowan had seen the look in her eyes the moment the first real contraction hit. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't even spoken much. Instead, he had moved into action, swift, quiet, and prepared, like a man who had faced storms, avalanches, and blood before. Only this time, he wasn't fighting nature. He was fighting time itself. He added logs to the fire until it roared. He poured snow into pots to melt for water. He checked the gaps in the roof and stuffed wool into every hole he could find to keep the heat in. When a sudden gust ripped at the shutters, threatening to blow them open, he grabbed his tools and climbed up to reinforce the rafters while the wind howled around him. Nancy groaned, clutching her belly as another contraction ripped through her like a blade. "Rowan," she gasped. "It's too early. I'm not ready." He knelt beside her, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos. "You are stronger than you know." She trembled, terror filling her eyes. What if she doesn't? What if she cannot breathe? He placed both hands firmly on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "I will not let you do this alone." The next hour passed in a blur of blinding pain. Nancy writhed, clinging to the edge of the bedding, her fingers digging into the rough fabric until her knuckles turned white. Rowan sat by her side the entire time. He heated water, wrung out cloths to wipe the feverish sweat from her brow, and placed a steadying hand behind her back with every wave of pain. At one point, she screamed a raw, helpless sound that tore through the cabin. Rowan cupped her face between his large, calloused palms, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "Breathe with me," he whispered, his voice like stone worn soft by years of wind. "Match my breath." She did. It was ragged, and she was sobbing, but she matched him when the storm outside grew louder. Shaking the very walls, Rowan added more wood, banking the fire high. He wrapped thick pelts along the cabin walls to insulate them, and spread his own heavy coat across the floor where Nancy lay. She was losing strength. Her hands had gone limp at her sides. Her legs shook uncontrollably. Rowan knelt again, his voice urgent. "Nancy," she opened her eyes, barely able to focus. I cannot do it." "Yes, you can." Her eyes filled with tears. "I am so scared." He bent closer, his hands cradling her shoulders, his eyes locking onto hers. "You have fought this whole world to protect this child. You've chopped trees and built a shelter with your bare hands. You have more courage than any man I have ever known." Tears ran down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat. Rowan's voice broke slightly, thick with emotion. "You do not need to fight alone anymore." With a final cry, raw from her very soul, Nancy pushed. Silence followed. For one breath, then to and then, a sound rose into the air, wet, sharp, and undeniable. A cry. The cry of a newborn. Rowan's hands trembled as he caught the small, slick body. He wrapped the baby quickly in his heavy wool coat to shield her from the cold. The firelight flickered over the child's face, tiny and flushed red with life. "A girl," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "You have a daughter." Nancy collapsed backward, sobbing in exhaustion. But her eyes were locked on the bundle in his arms. "Let me see her," she whispered. Rowan placed the bundle gently in her arms. The coat dwarfed the child, but her tiny fists reached up, warm and alive. Nancy looked at the baby, then up at Rowan. "You saved us," she said hoarsely. Rowan knelt beside them, his hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "No," he said softly. "You saved her. You kept her alive." Nancy turned her face to the firelight, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she smiled. It was weak and trembling, but it was real. Rowan looked down at the baby. The fire glinted in his eyes, and something old, something buried deep within him beneath layers of grief and ice stirred. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was hope. Spring crept into the Absaroka range like a whispered promise. The snow melted in rivulets, turning the creeks into rushing torrents. The ground softened, and green shoots pushed through soil that had known only frost for months. The cabin, once barely more than canvas and for shaky walls, now stood strong. Beams held the roof securely, shutters blocked the wind, and chimney smoke curled upward in steady gray wisps. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a home. Each morning, Rowan worked beside Nancy. They rebuilt the fence from salvaged pine. Nancy, with her baby wrapped tight against her chest in a sling, steadied the posts while Rowan hammered them deep into the earth. Afternoons were spent tilling the soil behind the cabin, planting potatoes and hardy greens. Their rhythm was quiet, easy. They weren't lovers, not yet, but they were something close. Partners in survival. Nancy had not believed she would ever know peace again, but here it was, growing out of the dirt. Then Reeves returned. It was the second warmest day of the year. Rowan was chopping kindling near the woodpile. Nancy was sowing her first row of potatoes. The baby, now 2 months old, slept in a cedar cradle Rowan had carved, its legs etched with tiny stars and leaves. The knock at the gate wasn't polite. It was loud, intentional. A warning. Gideon Reeves stood there, coated in trail dust. His bowler hat was crooked, and his smile was rusted and thin. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him waited several men in town coats and polished boots, badges flashing in the sun. "A posse." "Well," Reeves said, his gaze skimming from Rowan to Nancy with a sneer. "Did not expect to find this place still standing, let alone growing." Nancy rose from the garden, brushing dirt from her hands. She didn't look afraid this time. She looked tired of him. "What do you want?" Reeves pulled a folded document from his coat and shook it open with a snap. "Your land claim. Seems it was never properly filed. Technically void." "That is false," Nancy replied, her voice steady. Reeves smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "It is now." Rowan stepped forward, his axe lowering to his side. But Nancy lifted a hand to stop him. She moved to the gate alone, her shoulders squared. "I built this house," she said, pointing to the cabin. "I gave birth here. I survived the winter here. You cannot take it." "I am not taking anything," Reeves replied smoothly, holding out the paper. "Sign this, walk away, or I enforce removal by law." Nancy's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "And if I don't?" Reeves' voice hardened. "Then I remove you by force." Rowan moved then. He didn't run, but he flowed like water, stepping up just behind her. He was silent, steady. He carried no weapon, but his stance was clear. He would not let her stand alone. "This land is mine," Nancy said again, looking Reeves dead in the eye. Reeves' jaw twitched. The humiliation of the winter visit was clearly still burning him. Then, suddenly, he reached into his coat. He drew a revolver. "Sign it," he barked, aiming the barrel straight at her chest. "Or I will." A sharp crunch of boots on gravel cut him off. Rowan stepped in front of Nancy, his hands raised, palms out. "You will have to shoot me first," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Reeves didn't hesitate. He fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the clearing, louder than thunder. Birds scattered from the trees in a panic. Rowan staggered back, a bloom of red spreading instantly across his shoulder. Nancy screamed, a sound that tore the air. But Rowan did not fall. He stood tall, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury that made Reeves take a step back. "You will not touch her," Rowan growled, the words grinding out through the pain. "Not ever again." From the trees, shouts erupted. It wasn't reinforcements for Reeves. It was the townspeople. Men and women with worried eyes emerged from the forest path, having followed the commotion. Among them, striding forward with a grim face, was the sheriff and a clerk from the land office. They took in the scene in a single, horrified glance, Reeves standing there with a smoking gun, and Rowan, unarmed, bleeding onto the gravel. Panic erupted. In moments, the sheriff was on Reeves, wresting the revolver from his hand. Two other men grabbed Reeves by the arms, restraining him as he shouted protests about federal authority. "That's enough, Reeves," the sheriff barked. He ripped the shiny badge from Reeves' coat and shoved it into his own pocket. "You just shot an unarmed man on disputed property. That's not law enforcement. That's attempted murder." Reeves struggled, his face turning a mottled red. But the crowd had turned against him. They had seen enough. The clerk stepped forward, looking pale. "We'll review the claim ourselves," he stammered, looking at Nancy. "Properly this time. I suspect Mr. Reeves has been misplacing files for a while now." The sheriff tipped his hat to Nancy, his expression apologetic. "We're sorry, ma'am. Your claim will be reviewed and fully honored. You have my word." As the noise of the arrest faded and the group began dragging Reeves back toward the trail, quiet returned to the clearing. But Nancy didn't care about the sheriff or the land claim in that moment. She dropped to her knees beside Rowan, pressing both of her hands hard against his shoulder to staunch the bleeding. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. Rowan winced, his face pale, but he didn't pull away. He looked down at her, hands on him. "Worse things have happened. You shouldn't have." Tears spilled over her lashes. "He could have killed you. I would do it again," he said softly. And looking at his eyes, Nancy knew he meant it. He would stand in front of a bullet for her and Clara 1,000 times over. Nancy's voice broke, the fear of the last few months finally crashing down on her. "You can't leave us, please." Rowan looked at her. He really looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't the guarded, polite smile she had seen before. It was something gentler, something open. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "There's too much left to build." The envelope came on a clear April morning. It was crisp and white, standing out against the dark wood of the cabin table. Nancy opened it with steady fingers, though her heart was hammering a rhythm against her ribs. Inside was a document bearing the official stamp of the Wyoming Territory. It was confirmation, legal, permanent, indisputable ownership of the land. She stared at it for a long moment, the black ink blurring slightly as her eyes watered. Then, she set it down on the table beside Clara's cradle. The land was hers, not by charity, not by inheritance. She had fought for it with blood, resolve, and the help of a man she had once feared to accept. Outside, spring had fully touched the mountains. The world was bathed in golden light. Snowmelt rushed down the creek, sounding like laughter. Wildflowers were blooming in riots of purple and yellow, and birds sang from the budding branches of the pines. Rowan was near the barn, fitting cedar planks together. The rich, sharp scent of shaved wood hung in the air. He wasn't fixing a fence this time. He was building something new. It was a cradle, not the rough box they had used through the desperate winter months, but a polished piece of true craftsmanship. The rails were smooth, hand-sanded until they felt like silk. Along the edge, Rowan was using a small chisel to carve intricate designs, tiny stars, and pine needles. Nancy recognized the tool. It was the one his late fiancé had used to carve toys. She walked over to stand beside him. Clara swaddled close in a sling across her chest. Rowan glanced at her, then back to his work, blowing wood shavings off the delicate carving. "She deserves more than what we gave her during the storm," he said quietly, running his thumb over a carved star. Nancy smiled, watching his hands work. "You made this beautiful. I wanted her to have something peaceful," he replied. "Something made with love, not desperation." That afternoon, they brought the cradle inside and placed it beneath the window, where the afternoon light pooled across the floor warmth. They laid Clara inside. She kicked her legs and settled instantly, sleeping soundly in the bed Rowan had made for her. Spring deepened into early summer. Their rhythm changed again. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. Together, they reinforced the awning with thick beams. Rowan dug a proper well beside the old apple tree so Nancy wouldn't have to haul water from the creek. They cleared out the brambles and tilled new earth, planting rows of potatoes, squash, and onions that were already showing green tops. One morning, Rowan knelt beside the cradle, letting Clara wrap her tiny fingers around his massive index finger. Her grip surprised him, strong and determined. Nancy leaned in the doorway, drying a dish, watching them, seeing his hands made for wilderness, for hunting, for violence when necessary, holding her daughter with such infinite care. It stilled her heart. She's strong, Rowan said, smiling up at Nancy. She gets that from both sides, Nancy replied. That evening, the air in the cabin was warm and smelled of pine resin and milk. Rowan stood near the cradle, watching the baby stir. He reached out as if to lift Clara, his hands hovering for a split second. Then he stopped. He pulled his hands back slightly and looked at Nancy. "May I?" he asked. His voice was rough, uncertain. Nancy froze. Her heart caught in her chest. She thought back to her life before this mountain. No man had ever asked for her permission like that. Not her father, not Thomas, her husband. They took what they wanted, her dowry, her dignity, her trust. But here was Rowan, a man who could snap a pine log in two. Yet he was waiting, always waiting for her to say yes. Yes, she whispered. He lifted Clara with both hands, cradling her close to his chest. The baby made a small, contented sound and nuzzled into the rough wool of his shirt. Nancy watched them, and she felt something inside her chest finally let go. Her walls, once made of steel and fear, were softening. In the days that followed, a steadier life began to bloom in the clearing. They shared meals at the small table, stews made from the garden vegetables, and venison Rowan brought home. They planted herbs in clay pots on the windowsill. In the evenings, Nancy mended clothes by the firelight while Clara cooed nearby, and Rowan sat opposite her, cleaning his tools or carving. Rowan never presumed. He never pushed for more than she offered. He listened when she spoke, and he was comfortable in the silence when she didn't. Nancy grew to love the quiet strength of him. She loved his stillness, his patience, and his way of leaving space in the room instead of trying to fill it up with noise or demands. One breezy afternoon, as apple blossom petals scattered across the yard like snow, Nancy stopped her work. She looked at him across the garden. "You never tried to take anything from me," she said quietly. Rowan paused, resting his hands on the handle of his shovel. He didn't look away. "I never will." That night, after tucking Clara into her cradle, Nancy stood at the window. The moon hung low and heavy over the hills, painting the world in silver. On the porch, she could see Rowan sitting on the steps, whittling a small block of wood by the light of a lantern. Nancy stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders against the night chill. She sat down beside him. The air was cool and clean. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The only sound was the scrape of his knife against the wood. Then she reached out. Her hand trembled slightly, but she laid it gently over his. Stopping the knife, Rowan paused. He turned his palm upward, letting their fingers twine together. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't a sudden spark. It was a choice made quietly, together, under the vast western stars. Weeks turned into a season, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The light filtered through the pine needles and flickered on the face of the cabin. It was finished. It stood strong now, no longer a makeshift shelter fighting against gravity. The timber was secure, the chinking was tight, the roof slanted just right to repel the mountain storms, and the chimney sent a thin, confident trail of smoke into the spring air. It wasn't just a structure. It was a home. Nancy stood on a wooden beam, a hammer in her hand, while Rowan held the final support post in place for the porch awning. The sound of wood meeting iron echoed steady. "Sure, final. There," she said, breathing hard but smiling as she wiped her forehead. "The last one." Rowan didn't move for a moment. He just looked up at the cabin, inspecting the work. Then he looked at her. Nancy saw that familiar flicker in his eyes, the way he had looked at the mountains after a long climb, searching for something more than just the view. As the light began to dim, they stepped down onto solid earth. Clara was babbling from her blanket on the porch, her little fists waving in the air at dust motes. Rowan bent to pick up a dropped tool, but his movements were slower than usual. Thoughtful, he stood up, brushing the dust from his pants, and glanced toward the cabin, then back to Nancy. "I've been thinking," he said. Nancy raised an eyebrow, a playful smile touching her lips as she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "That's usually dangerous." He gave a small, rare chuckle. Then his face grew serious again, though his eyes remained warm. "You and Clara," he started, searching for the right words. "You have your land. You have your home. You do not need anyone. You proved that." He took a breath. "But if there is room for one more set of hands, someone to help with the planting, to do the repairs, or just to rock Clara to sleep when your arms are tired." He paused, looking down at his boots, then met her gaze again. "I'll be here. If you choose me." Nancy stared at him. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. There was no pressure in his voice, no demand, no claim of ownership. Just a man standing with open hands and honest eyes, offering everything he had. She stepped closer, holding Clara tight against her chest. The baby's warmth seeped into her ribs, a grounding weight in the moment. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the pine trees and brushing past them like a quiet witness to what was happening. Nancy looked at Rowan. She didn't look at him as the man who had saved her from the snow. She didn't even look at him as the man who had stood between her and Reeves' gun. She looked at him as someone who had given her the space to breathe again. She saw a man who had waited, patiently and without ego, for her to find her own words. She reached out and took his calloused hand in hers. His grip was warm, rough, and real. "Not because I need you," she said, her voice steady and clear in the mountain air, "but because I choose you." Rowan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't say anything he didn't have to. He lowered his forehead to touch hers, gently, reverently. It was a gesture without words, but it was full of meaning. It was a mountain man's vow, silent, solid, and unbreakable. Clara giggled in her mother's arms, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, reaching out her chubby hands to touch both of their faces. The door to the cabin creaked open behind them, letting the last of the sunlight spill across the threshold. Nancy led the way inside, Rowan close behind, with Clara nestled safely between them. The cabin glowed golden with the firelight. Pots hung from hooks, the cradle rocked gently in the corner, and the smell of pine resin and warm bread filled the air. It was a simple space, but it was rich with life. Outside, the wind no longer howled. It whispered. On that piece of wild land, carved out of hardship and resilience, love did not come crashing in like a storm. It came like spring, quiet, patient, chosen, because they had learned the most important lesson of the frontier. The strongest people were not the ones who faced the storm alone, but the ones who learned to let someone face it with them. Thank you for riding with us through this breathtaking frontier of survival, strength, and second chances. Nancy and Rowan's story wasn't just about building a cabin in the wilderness. It was about building trust, healing from the past, and making the brave decision to choose love even when it's hardest to believe in it. If this story touched your heart, made you tear up, or just gave you hope that even in the harshest wilderness, love can still find its way, don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. It really helps us bring more stories like this to life. And if you want more emotional, slow-burn Western love story content like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next tale of resilience, redemption, and real love. We'll see you on the next ride down the dusty trail.